Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Batman Begins. Now, I already reviewed this movie back in 2013 when I first started doing these Batman reviews, but I decided to redo the review because this is a great movie, and honestly, my old review, from what I remember, kinda sucked. Now, Batman Begins came out in 2005 and was co-written and directed by Christopher Nolan, who prior to this directed films like Following, Memento, and Insomnia, and he would go on to direct movies like The Prestige, Interstellar, Inception, Dunkirk, as well as the two sequels to this movie, The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises. The film is also co-written by David S. Goyer, who also wrote the 1992 horror film Demonic Toys for Full Moon. He also wrote the Blade movies and The Crow City of Angels. He would go on to write Man of Steel, and I know he wrote the original story for Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice. Now, the movie is based on the comic book character of Batman, originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. However, the movie itself is kind of a loose adaptation of Frank Miller's graphic novel Batman Year One. The movie also takes inspiration from the Jeff Loeb graphic novel Batman the Long Halloween, as well as the Denny O'Neil Batman comic The Man Who Falls. Now, before this, obviously you had the Tim Burton Batman movies, which for the time really did take the character of Batman and make him much darker than people were really used to. Now, granted, in the comics, Batman was already starting to become dark, but as far as the mainstream were concerned, Batman was just the goofy, like, Adam West sort of thing, and Tim Burton's Batman movies, while they are a little goofy by today's standards, they were still pretty dark for the time, and they really took the storyline seriously. But then you had the Joel Schumacher Batman films, which really kind of made Batman a joke. And Batman and Robin is rightfully so considered to be one of the worst movies ever made, and that movie for a while kind of killed the Batman franchise, at least outside of the comics and the animated series. But shortly after Batman and Robin, there were some talks of doing a fifth film in the Tim Burton / Joel Schumacher Batman series called Batman Triumphant, and I actually think that movie would have been interesting. I don't know if it would have been any good, but it definitely would have been interesting to see, especially because they were going to try to bring Jack Nicholson back as the Joker in sort of a dream sequence or a flashback. But that project ended up falling through because I think after how poorly received Batman and Robin was, DC and Warner Brothers probably didn't want Joel Schumacher ever touching anything Batman related ever again. But for a while during the time between Batman and Robin and this movie, there was a point where Darren Aronofsky, who directed films like Requiem for a Dream and Pi, was actually going to do a straight adaptation of Frank Miller's Year One. But that project unfortunately never came to fruition, but eventually we got this movie. And this movie, not only did it resurrect the Batman franchise, but it also got people to really take the idea of a superhero origin story seriously. Like, this movie really does treat Batman's origin as serious drama. This is really a drama film that just happens to be based on characters from the Batman mythos. And I think a lot of the superhero movies we're getting today, for better or worse, owe something to this movie. Now, the plot of Batman Begins is it portrays Gotham City as severely economically depressed, and the city is plagued with crime and corruption, and pretty much all of the police force and most of the judges are owned by the mob. The movie follows Bruce Wayne, who comes from a very rich and famous family, and as a child he witnesses the murder of his parents by a street thug named Joe Chill. Years later, Joe Chill is being released from jail for testifying against a vicious crime lord named Carmine Falcone, and Bruce Wayne, who is a young man at this point, goes to the courthouse with a gun, actually with the intent on killing Joe Chill, but then somebody beats him to the punch, obviously somebody who is sent by Falcone. When he tells his friend Rachel, who is also the assistant DA, that he was about to kill Joe Chill, she of course is ashamed of him that he would stoop to that level, and she brings up that, yes, what Joe Chill did was unforgivable, but he was a man driven to desperation. So, seeing what Carmine Falcone is doing to the city, Bruce makes it his mission to try to fight the crime and corruption in Gotham City. So, he ends up leaving the country where nobody will know who he is, and he tries to learn about the criminal element. Ultimately, he ends up joining this group of vigilantes who call themselves the League of Shadows. He gets training from the League of Shadows, but ends up rebelling against them when he realizes that they're extremists who are willing to kill the criminals that they fight, which Bruce feels is going too far. And it turns out that they want to destroy Gotham City, which they feel is the worst example of all of the world's crime and corruption, and hold the city up as an example for the rest of the world. So, Bruce ends up returning to Gotham City, and with the training he received, as well as military-grade technology that his family's company owns, he ends up becoming a masked vigilante called the Batman. And in the movie, Bruce's friend Rachel, who as I said is the assistant DA, she becomes suspicious of a criminal psychologist named Jonathan Caine, who has diagnosed all of Falcone's men as being criminally insane, and she thinks that Caine is working for Falcone. But as she starts looking into him, she discovers that there's something much more sinister going on with Caine. It turns out that Caine is experimenting on his patients with a toxin that could actually make you hallucinate what your greatest fears are, and it turns out that Caine is also working for the League of Shadows, who want to weaponize his toxin to essentially get the entire city to tear itself apart out of fear. So now Bruce Wayne as Batman has to stop them. In the movie, Christian Bale plays Bruce Wayne and Batman, and he does an amazing job. This movie really does explore Bruce Wayne as a character, and you see the psychological effects being Batman has on him as a person. In this film, you really do get a sense that Wayne is a very psychologically tortured man. I also really liked how you see the different facets of Wayne's personality. You see him as he really is, but you also see him put on a face for the public where he pretends to be this arrogant, spoiled brat, and then you see him as the Batman. Michael Caine plays Alfred. Now, Michael Gough played this character in the Tim Burton movies, and he did a great job in those movies, but Michael Caine does a brilliant job in this movie. In this film, you get a real sense of just how much Alfred loves Bruce, and how he really has become a father figure to Bruce after Bruce's parents were murdered. Katie Holmes plays Bruce's childhood friend, Rachel Dawes. I know a lot of people didn't like her in this movie. Personally, I had no problem with her. Now, Rachel is not a character from the comics. She was an original character created for the film. I do think Rachel is a good character, and I like how she's not your conventional love interest. Gary Oldman plays Jim Gordon. This is, of course, before he becomes Commissioner Gordon. To me, Gary Oldman really is the definitive live-action Jim Gordon. Let's face it, Pat Hingle's Commissioner Gordon from the Tim Burton films was an absolute buffoon. Gary Oldman really does the character from the comics a justice. Jim Gordon is a genuinely good cop who is unfortunately forced to work with all these dirty cops. The movie also gives a believable explanation as to why Gordon would work with a vigilante, because Gotham's police force is so corrupt. Morgan Freeman plays Lucius Fox, who supplies Bruce with the technology that he needs, and Morgan Freeman is of course great in the movie. Ken Watanabe has a small role in this movie as a character who you think is Ra's al Ghul, or Ra's al Ghul, however you want to say it, the leader of the League of Shadows, but you find out later on that he was just a decoy. Liam Neeson plays the real Ra's al Ghul, who ends up being the main villain of the film. What makes him really work in this movie is the fact that he genuinely seems to believe what he's doing is right, which makes him even scarier because you know he'll never stop. In a way, he is a sympathetic character because him and Batman essentially want the same thing, but Ra's al Ghul is an extremist who is willing to destroy hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent lives lives just to destroy all the crime and corruption in Gotham City. I also think it's interesting that him and Bruce Wayne start out the movie as friends, and Ra's is even the one who trains Bruce, but they end up becoming enemies, really just because of a difference of ideology. Now, in the comics, Ra's al Ghul is actually a supernatural villain where you find out that he's hundreds of years old, but he resurrects himself using what's known as the Lazarus Pit. But since Nolan tries to go for a more realistic approach, Ra's al Ghul is just a regular human. However, he does hint that there might be something supernatural going on with him, but Nolan leaves that completely up to the viewer's interpretation. Cillian Murphy plays Jonathan Crane, or the Scarecrow, who is the secondary antagonist of the film. I think it's interesting that Nolan made him only a secondary villain instead of being the main one, especially because I think Scarecrow is a more recognizable villain than Ra's al Ghul, but Murphy does an amazing job in this movie, and he really does play Crane as a sociopath. In the film, Tom Wilkinson plays Carmine Falcone, who is a character who was originally created by Frank Miller for Batman Year One. Falcone is kind of the third villain of the film, and he's a scary motherfucker in this movie. Like, he really is just this vicious, ruthless gangster. The film also has Rutger Hauer in a small role. Rutger Hauer was one of my favorite actors, who unfortunately died last year, and it was great to see him in this movie, even though his character is a real asshole, and Richard Brake plays Joe Chill in the film. I also think it would be a sin not to talk about the end sequence of the film, where the League of Shadows releases Crane's fear toxin into Gotham City, and all these people start hallucinating. Like, that sequence honestly has some genuine horror elements to it. But yeah, Batman Begins is an excellent movie. Even if you don't like superhero movies, this is definitely one of the best examples of the superhero genre, because it takes the subject matter seriously. As silly as the basic premise is, I mean, okay, this is a guy dressing up as a giant bat. It is a silly premise when you break it down. It takes it seriously in context of the universe that the movie establishes. And again, it takes this premise and treats it like serious drama. Now, when the movie came out, Christopher Nolan got a lot of praise for taking the Batman mythos and making it ultra-realistic. And it's not ultra-realistic. Like, it's arguably as reality-based as a story like Batman could possibly be, but it's not completely realistic. There's still a lot of stuff in this movie that is very comic booky. Like, there is a scene in this movie where Batman uses this sonar technology to get all these bats to come to one place, almost as if he's controlling the bats, and I'm pretty sure something like that can't happen in real life, or at least it wouldn't happen the same way. And also, in the movie, the League of Shadows want to use this technology that could vaporize an entire area's water supply in a matter of seconds, and I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure nothing like that exists in real life, at least not yet. Like, there is a lot of stuff in this movie that is very much based in sci-fi. Like, it is kind of a science fiction movie to a certain extent. Now, as I pointed out already, the film spawned a sequel in 2008 called The Dark Knight, and while this movie was a huge hit when it came out, The Dark Knight became a phenomenon. And then you had The Dark Knight Rises in 2012, which closed out the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy. But even Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice, which was a sequel to Man of Steel and was a reboot of the Batman franchise, even though that's set outside of the Nolan continuity, that one I think definitely owes something to this movie. And even the upcoming Batman movie with Robert Pattinson I think probably owes something to this. I especially think the Todd Phillips film Joker owes something to the Nolan films, because that takes the whole idea of taking something from the Batman mythos and making it more realistic. Like, that takes it one step further, where Joker feels about as in the real world as we're ever going to get with something based on Batman. But I also think even the Marvel Cinematic Universe owes something to this, because I think the director of Iron Man, which was the first film in the Marvel Cinematic cinematic universe. I think he even said that at the time he made that, he was trying to go for sort of a Batman Begins kind of approach. But even outside of the superhero genre, this really did sort of set the stage for a lot of other reboots of existing franchises, like James Bond, Star Trek. I even want to say the 2014 reboot of Godzilla probably owes something to this. But that was my review on Batman Begins, and bye.